Mirëmbrëma dhe mirë se vini në kallëzo për një me. Sonte e kam një njeri shumë special në intervistë, është Jeremy Bowen, I cili sapo ka mri prej Kharkivit në Ukrainë, ku është të raportu për luftën, sepse është redaktori ndërkombëtar I BBC-së. Është gazetari kryesor I BBC-së që e çojnë në zonat ma të nxehta të luftës në momentin që po ndodhen. Jeremy Bowen është mas shumë të I njohur në Angli si njeri që ka shkruajt libra për lindjen e mesme, një kohë gjatë ka raportu prej Jerusalemit edhe zonave të palestineze në lindjen e mesme, është specializon në lindjen e mesme, edhe kur ka fillu lufta, ka qenë lindjen e mesme që atëherë në Jerusalem kur kanë fillu bombardimet e NATO-s, edhe në atë moment ka vendos BBC-a me qu, kur e bo kriza e madhe në Kosovë, me qu edhe me raportu në Kosovë. Unë kam punu me ta në prej mars 99-s deri në qershor korrekt 99-ën, qatë pjesë të luftës e kemi mbulu bashkë, është kthy 25 vjet pas luftës, ka qenë Kosovë që 25 vjet, është ftu me ftesë të shtetit tonë për të qenë prezent në ceremonitë ndryshme që ishin për 25 vjetore. Jeremy, welcome back to Kosovo. You have literally not been here since 99.
Yeah, except one day for a couple of hours, but apart from that, this is my first visit basically since NATO arrived.
That doesn't count. It was in the airport. You haven't been back properly.
No, correct.
First, what were the impressions 25 years later, sitting in that podium outside this reporter's house, looking at the Kosovo army passing by?
So much has changed. You know, it's 25 years. You've got to expect that. But, you know, let's be honest, 25 years ago, Pristina was a pretty sad and depressed city in so many ways, physically anyway, the way that it looked. I think it's transformed now. You know, you have this wonderful boulevard outside. I remember when that was a street with cars going up and down it and British soldiers in that street as well. And now there are these great cafes and you had the military parade showing that the country's prepared to defend itself. So yeah, I'm very impressed.
You are a correspondent which is busy with every single war that starts. They send you, they engage you as international editor. Why did you jump into the opportunity to come back, to make an effort, leave Kharkiv? You were reporting on Kharkiv.
Yeah.
Why does Kosovo matter to you personally first?
Well, all the wars of the former Yugoslavia mattered a lot to me. It was a really important part on a personal level of my life. I was in my 30s when I was reporting here. I followed all the wars essentially since Croatia-Serbia in 91. I was very extensively in Bosnia in 92 to 95. Spent a lot of time in Sarajevo, in Mostar, other places. Did documentaries as well as news reporting, and then so when in 99 I had a chance to come back, by then I was working in the Middle East, I jumped at it and I spent months in northern Albania, in Kuks, with the refugees, and then when the Germans came in over the border, I came in with them, and of course I was working with you in those days. You were my guide to the country, and you know, I really strongly felt, and I still feel actually, that for us in Europe it was a really important period, important years, and it was my responsibility as a BBC reporter, as a journalist, to try and report it, decode it, explain it, try and tell people the significance of what was going on. Back in Britain, a lot of people thought that it was all way too complicated and try to switch off, I think, and we try to stop that happening.
So why did first can you explain the situation you found in Kukas and then the chaos when you entered from Kukas?
We found there, you know, tens of thousands of refugees, and most of the reporting we were doing was based on the stories that the refugees told. And so every day we'd go up to the point where the place where they were crossing over the border, and talk to people, sometimes follow them back in the town, in the camps where they were staying. And the town was absolutely overrun with thousands and thousands of these people. And the stories were always a little bit different. And so we were able to get something really nearly every day. And don't forget, of course, that back then in the 90s, it wasn't like, say, you look at the war in Gaza now, a lot of video comes out that people take with their phones and then they post on social media. Well, in the 1990s, we didn't have phones with cameras, and there wasn't social media, or indeed there wasn't much of an internet. It was only just starting to post those things on. So we really relied on word of mouth from talking to people who were coming out about the situation inside.
Mm. The most dramatic films that you did at that time, TV reports, are of the moments when you entered with Germans.
Yeah.
I would first want to talk about the report in Prizreni. You arrive in Prizreni, there's a shootout,
yeah,
and you film remarkably the withdrawal of a few Serbian soldiers swearing at Albanian inhabitants of Prizreni. An incredible film to exist today.
Yeah, it was remarkable looking back on it because, of course, it's here in this exhibition, and I haven't seen any of that. I literally have not seen any of those reports since we did them and sent them off.
Yeah.
There's the nature of television news. Sometimes you do it, you send it, and then you don't get a chance to see it again. So I think looking back on those pieces, they have a lot of immediacy. And this, for me, for what has been very important for me in my whole reporting career, and I've been with the BBC for 40 years now, is being there, using your own, being an eyewitness, using your own eyes, using your own ears, seeing things for yourself. And what was really great from a journalistic point of view about doing that story was that we had the access. All too often these days, and Gaza is a great example, I've been trying to report that story, we don't have that access. But then we had that access, so we were there as things were happening, and we were able to capture some very powerful scenes, which really showed the depth of the conflict, the chasm between the two sides, and the way that there was so much hatred on both sides.
You say that, but many people would know that in the most dramatic moment of Kosovo's history when biggest crimes occurred, which is during the NATO bombing, March to June, very few, hardly any international journalists were allowed to stayed in, got in. So when you came, you had dramatic pictures and access to the remains of what happened.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we couldn't get in there with on what was then the Serb-controlled side. They wouldn't let us in. But we were able to come in with NATO, and then the whole place opened up. And because we got in at the same time as the troops, and then were able to move freely, the only real restriction was the fear we might step on a mine or some unexploded bomb. We were able, as you'll remember, to get to places as they opened up, when people hadn't seen outsiders for quite a long time, when there were still, in some cases, bodies lying around the place, certainly evidence, fresh evidence of crimes that had taken place, of massacres.
I only realized later, Jeremy, that because we were based not in Pristina, we came in through Albania and were based in the first 2 weeks of our entry with German troops in Dukagjin, what is called the Dukagjin, West Kosovo, Dukagjin area. It's where later I found out that these are where the biggest massacres had taken place. In Nemea, over 300 people. In Krusha, over 100 men. I remember the smell, the stench in the main roads. When I resaw your pieces, you talked about this smell. How do you put that feeling in the pieces, and what do you remember from that time? How Dukagjini area looked like? How did it smell like?
Well, you go from town to village, go along that road, the roads that came out of Prizreni, went towards Jakovo, and there were small villages and farms. And sometimes the way that we detect that there might be something that had happened was by the smell, because you could smell, because bodies were often left where they'd been killed. Or if they'd been buried in really shallow graves. And don't forget, by then, you know, the weather was hot, and human bodies deteriorate very quickly in the heat, and the smell is disgusting and very characteristic, that awful rotting smell. So yeah, we could, I felt it was important to try and pass on. I think one of the jobs of being a reporter is to give people an idea of what it's like to be there. And part of that is the smell, and of course you can't get the smell through the screen. But you know, for example, in one of the reports I did that you've got running in this BBC room here, they're burying somebody, and you can see the guys who are carrying the body as they take him to the wrapped body, as they take him to his grave. They're wrinkling up their noses like that because they could smell the body had been lying out. It must have been stinking.
You have these, of course, body images, but then you have a very, let's say, a romantic image shot by Nick Millard with a report that starts off with a bird going through a lane. There's nothing there. There's no body. There's no burning. But your words next to that picture leaves you breathless. What is that about?
Well, the cameraman who shot it, Nick Millard, who we both know very well and I still work with from time to time, he sat on the roof of our armoured Land Rover, the kind of vehicle you've just got parked outside the exhibition. And as we drove, I was driving, and he said, drive slowly, drive slowly. We drove slowly down this lane into this village. And when we were sitting, part of the process of putting together a TV report is going through all the material and deciding which order, what you want to use, what you want to throw away, the order in which you use it. You know, later on in that story, there's a lot of things that look like war: burning buildings, sad people, funeral, site of massacres, stuff like that. But I thought, no, we need to show something a little bit different and make the contrast between what seemed to be a peaceful rural scene, and of course for many years it would have been peaceful beforehand, and what actually happened there. And so what I was trying to do was to build the contrast and tell a story, not simply bang, 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 but try and paint a picture of the place. And looking back on it, yeah, I'm proud of it. I think it works really well.
I would like to share a few seconds that we allowed of this opening piece that you and Nick Millard did in June '99 next to Prizreni.
Early evening, Prizreni. German troops opened fire. One of them had just been shot and wounded, they believed, by the men in the car. The driver was killed and his passenger seriously wounded. The Germans fired back from a tank covered in flowers, left from the rapturous welcome they'd had from Prizreni's ethnic Albanians. The Germans were all greeted like heroes. Every soldier that arrived made them feel safer. For these people, the Germans are liberators and protectors.
But we know that now we are free. NATO soldiers are here.
But soon the desire of ethnic Albanians to get their own back broke surface. And so did the humiliation and rage of the Serbs. German troops forced back a group of Serb soldiers who'd moved too close to the crowd. Across town, German armor was moving again, this time to protect Serbs. At the military hospital, the Serbs were preparing a convoy of fighters, medics and civilians to be moved back towards Serbia when the Germans decided it was safe. The commander, an army doctor, said leaving Kosovo was the worst day of his life, and he blamed Yugoslavia's president, Slobodan Milosevic.
Svi ratovi su greška.
Every war is a mistake.
Milosevic's mistake?
Miloševićeva greška u ovom slučaju.
Miloševićeva
Ne,
greška.
objasnim, znaš šta, da
Dobro, dobro.
Milosevic's mistake.
Milošević's mistake.
A few minutes later, the Germans were trying to save the man they'd shot. His colleague was lying dead in the car. Eyewitnesses said the men were Serbs who'd attacked the Germans. Their weapons were on the pavement.
It's got very ugly here very quickly. There's a lot of hatred in this town and a big desire for revenge from the Serbs and from the ethnic Albanians. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Prizreni.
When Nick shot this, did he know what you're going to write about it? Why did he film this particular shot?
No, but he pointed out to me, he didn't know how I was going to write it, but we've worked together a lot and we have an understanding. And I think he realized I might be able to do something with the words to make it work. Because he suggested, I think, as an opening maybe, because it was different. And there's in Britain, there's a very long-running radio show called The Archers. It's like a soap opera set in a country village.
If I may say, we have an equivalent of Famiglia Moderna.
Okay.
We had that, so that's The Archers.
So The Archers, and it's about farmers and the dramas in their lives and the small things in their lives. So I remember saying to him, look, we've got to do it as if it's The Archers. And we set up the village. A lot of TV reporting is about giving you a sense of place, what it's like to be there. So I thought that was a good way into it. And he said to me, look, there's a bird that flies through the frame on the shot. So we used that particular part of it, of the shot. And no, I think I'm really happy with the piece, looking back at it. I think it really stands the test of time. I'm pleased with my writing. I work very hard on my scripts, I still do, because my feeling, writing in the English language for television, is that less is more. As long as you choose the right words, the fewer words you have, often the more impact that it has, because then you've got to make it work with the pictures. So that's what I try and do. We don't always succeed, but I think we did on that occasion.
Does it help that you actually write books? You write quite a lot of books. How many books have you written?
I've done 4, but I hadn't done any at that point. Yeah. But no, I like writing. I mean, writing is one of my things. And writing for the printed page is quite different to writing for television, because you don't have the pictures or the sound. And because in television you have the pictures and the sound, there's a lot you don't need to say. Or writing for television, a lot of it's about leaving things out. So I'll just say to people, if they look at a TV report and the reporter is telling you what you're seeing, here's the burning building. Well, they failed, because actually what you need to say is the building had been burning since the middle of the night. Tell them something extra that is a compliment to the pictures, that it's not just telling you what you're seeing, because you can see all that. You don't need to know. You don't need to be told. You've got to give the viewer some credit for their intelligence.
I would call these 4 or 5 pieces that were saved and are here with us in Pristina, because Nick Milad saved them 25 years later.
Wow.
He answered my call to send me what he got, and I thought he would have some leftovers, but he sent filmic pieces 25 years later, answering the call, sending them. And I want to talk about a particular next shot which most impressed our curator here, Gazmin Eyupi, who hadn't seen these pieces before. And you later talked about that shot also. There's an older woman speaking on camera, talking about her rage in finding dead relatives when she came back. And there's a burning house crashing just behind her, and her eyes never even flinching about it. It's an incredible shot.
No, amazing. No, and yeah, that was in the village, which was down that leafy lane where the bird was. And yeah, they were burning houses that had been owned by Serbs who had left the village, and looting some of them. And yeah, and the building just collapsed behind her, and she barely flickered and didn't notice what was going on because she was so focused on her grief. I think her sons had been killed by the Serbs. And because, of course, people get traumatized in war. And sometimes things that look now, with our eyes in peacetime, look look abnormal. In a war, they become normalized.
The next piece is very sad. There's an old woman that you find, you with another great translator that worked with us in Local Fixer. 17-year-old Arburuk Mata is there with you in camera, finding an old Serb woman in some village around Prizren.
It was inside Prizren, actually, in the city.
Was it inside?
Yeah, in the town, yeah.
Tell me about that piece.
Well, someone heard tell, someone in our team heard that there was a woman and maybe there was a body in the building with her, in her apartment. It was quite central, actually, in Prizren. She was old and she was really confused. And we went and knocking on the door and she was reluctant to open it. But then we managed to get inside, she let us come in. We found that the body of her dead husband was in the building, you could smell it, was in the apartment with her, in their home, wrapped up in a carpet. She'd wrapped him in a carpet. And she was confused about the details, but more or less she said that he had died during some kind of search by KLA forces. There was a hint that maybe they might have killed him, or maybe he collapsed. We just don't know. She was too confused to make a great deal of sense, but the fact was, the dead man was there. We saw the... And
the dead man had been there for 7 days.
Several days, yeah.
The body was rotting.
It was stinking.
You mentioned it was stinking.
It was stinking. It was hot. The weather was hot. It was stinking. She was in there, completely traumatized. There was pictures of maybe a grandson in the family album in Serb uniform.
That's the key to that report. Why is it so fair and explains the Kosovo story so well in a minute and a half, Jeremy? Because you show, the old woman was so confused. She showed you her grandson having been a military or paramilitary. So you could see that this family was engaged.
They were in the war, no question. And there was even pictures of her husband in the JLA, or in one of the Yugoslav partisan units or whatever during the Second World War. And so there was a lot of Yugoslav and Kosovo history in that album. I think those albums showing those sorts of things, often in that situation, I try and look for things like that. Because
that's what makes the report not one-sided. Although you have clearly a Serb victim who, his family member says, KLA has gone in and done this. Nevertheless, you balance it out like you're doing right now in very difficult situation, Middle East, balancing it out with the photograph that this woman had members of the family in the army, which suggests, without saying anything, that they might have killed Albanians too in the past.
I mean, it was a war. I mean, the thing is, war's complex. And I've, as a reporter, I've actually somewhat lost count, but I've definitely reported from more than 20 wars. And what you see is you can see good things and bad things on every side. No side has a monopoly of villains, and no side has a monopoly of angels, either.
What happens in that report is a lesson I got in journalism from you. I would call it an engaged journalism. Why? Because you get, in that report, I don't know if you remember, you call up KFOR and you say, listen, there's a body here. It's here for 7 days. I think you should come. You get involved, Jeremy. And that's the thing about what I learned from you, that it's not embarrassing it's not unprofessional, let me rephrase that, if you try and change the situation you're finding.
No, it's not. I think that's quite legit. I think I don't like seeing reporters getting involved and telling you how they feel. I'm not interested. I feel, I've seen things over the years, many, many things, some of which have made me absolutely angry, some of things have made me sad, a whole range of emotions. But the point is, what goes on the TV is not about how I feel. It's not about me. It's about the situation, about the people in the report. And yes, if I have got involved at times as the reporter,
okay, by
it's to
getting
reflect
involved,
that.
let's explain exactly how you got involved. So you're seen in camera calling K4, and you're seen waiting a few hours for K4 to come, and you're telling them what's going on in there. There's a body that's been there for 7 days, and you're, from a humanitarian point of view, you're just saying it's safe, it needs to come out for health and safety reasons.
All kinds of good reasons, yeah.
And everybody in the story, Jeremy seems to be just taking for granted what you say. You're the authority of trying to sort it out. For this little family, little mess you found, it's being addressed, that with as much dignity as it can, the body be removed, taken to places.
Yeah.
Why did you do that? You could have just gone home. Gone and done your report.
I'll be completely open with you. Partly because it would have been wrong to have just abandoned her, but also it made another section to end the piece. So it tells a story. And you couldn't just leave it hanging, goodbye, here's the body in the kitchen, here's the old lady, Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Prizreni. Well, that's not going to work.
How did you know the soldiers come? What if they wouldn't come?
Well, that would have been another story. Then we would have gone to talk to the commander and say, there's a dead body. And the thing is, at that point, the K4 soldiers, who in that case in Prizreni were Germans, they were law and order. They were the law. They had removed the authorities. The Serbs had gone. There hadn't yet been time for a local authority to emerge, or police force. And so they were the law. So it was their responsibility. And, you can't have civilians living in houses with dead bodies rotting in the kitchen.
But hang on, German K4 couldn't afford to go to every single body there was in that area. We saw hundreds, Jeremy, and they did not attend to each of these bodies. So this is the effect of media.
Yep. People were left to deal with their own dead. People in the village or whatever, they would have to dig a grave, get the body, bury the body. But no, the media is powerful, and obviously the Germans didn't want to be seen to be not doing anything in that situation. So if you call up, I'm well aware of the power of not just working for the media, but working for a global news organization like the BBC. And it's a power I'm aware of and an influence I'm aware of, and I feel strongly that that can't be abused. And also it's another good reason why we have to try and be fair in our reporting, because I think people actually listen and watch to what we're saying. And we have a very large audience. So sure, I would imagine if someone calls up and says, look, I'm the BBC correspondent, there's a body here, we're doing a story about it, it makes them concentrate. Yeah, sure, I accept that it is an example of the influence that the media has.
But it does differ. The fact, I've worked with many correspondents, over 15 BBC correspondents, the fact that you are definitely not one of those, hello, I'm an English journalist, does anybody here speak English, and is raped?
Yes, that's a famous phrase. No, I try not to be. By the time I was here in '99, I was already quite an experienced reporter. I had been a foreign correspondent for the BBC at that stage, but for more than 10 years. I'd been to quite a lot of big stories. And I particularly had spent months and years reporting on the breakup of Yugoslavia. So by 99, I'd already been living for 4 years in the Middle East, in Jerusalem. But when I came back here, it all came back to me. Of course, Kosovo had its own very individual and specific story, but the wider principles of reporting the war I remembered really well, and it all came back to me. I've covered many wars since then, and very big stories in the Middle East. I mean, huge stories, and 9/11 and all sorts of things. But it left a massive imprint on me, I think, because of probably the age I was at, the fact it was in Europe. I don't think that war should only belong in countries a long way away where people aren't white. It's not something that we don't have any automatic right to be peaceful in Europe, but I felt that strongly in the earlier years of the former Yugoslav wars, Western governments were ignoring what was going on. They could have done a lot more to stop the killing of innocent people. So it was, I was aware that there was no UN resolution, but I was pleased on a personal level seeing NATO moving in and doing something to stop the killing and the activities of Slobodan Milosevic and his allies.
Another evidence of why I know it impacted you, and you're not just saying this 25 years later because you're meeting me, is because you met a particular underage translator, a young 17, 16-year-old boy who spoke English, Arboro Kumata, in a refugee camp. You employed him and helped his life since.
Yes, well, Arba, he was a nice boy who spoke English well. We needed a translator. He was clearly intelligent.
How did you find him?
He came up to me. I was in the town square in Kukas in northern Albania, and there were people who had become refugees all around the place. And he came up and started, when I was waiting to do my live shot, he came up and started asking how it worked, what did we do, and I got talking to him, and he said that he'd actually come out that day with about 15 people crammed into a VW Golf. They'd taken out the back seat so everybody could squeeze in. And I said, well, so what are you going to do? Where are you sleeping tonight? He said, well, they're in the car, but I'll sleep out tonight because, the weather was fine. It wasn't a problem. But we really needed people to help us translate. So I said, look, are you busy tomorrow? Do you want to come and work for us? And he was successful at it. And towards the end of the war, I said, what are you going to do? I think it was from Jakova. He said, well, I'd like to go back to school, but my school has been burnt down. So I got on to a school that my sister had gone to, an international school in Wales, where I come from, and managed to get him in there. They were keen to have someone from Kosovo.
Jeremy, you just picked up the phone
I did.
in an international school in Wales, UK.
I picked up the satellite phone that was perched on the bonnet of the armored Land Rover, like the one outside. And I called him up. Yeah, well,
from Kukas or from?
No, it was from somewhere in the middle of the countryside. I can't remember.
Okay.
I think we were hanging around because we were filming.
And you told the school,
I said, look,
refugee.
here's this boy. He's a refugee. He was kicked out of his country. He's worked for us. He needs to finish his education. Can you help? He said, sure.
They just said, sure.
Yeah.
From that September.
I didn't tell Alba, though, that he could get in straight away because I didn't want him to get overconfident. So I told him he's going to have to talk to the people and impress them.
Yeah.
But actually, he was going to get in whatever happened.
He was very bright.
He was a bright boy, and he did well. He went to university in America. And, in a way, I wonder about interfering in people's lives like that because he stayed in America and he's a citizen there. Now, he works in, when I last heard from him a few years ago, he was working in Philadelphia in the insurance business.
That's one side of the coin, Jeremy.
Yeah.
The other side is Arbor Rukmata did so well academically in United World Colleges that since 99, they have started a scholarship program that every year, first with 2 students, then with 10. Now it's about 10,
Really? Wow.
10, young,
They still do it.
roughly about 5 to 10 high school students of Kosovo are given scholarships
Really?
in United World Colleges around
the world?
the world, not just Wales. So Albert opened
Well, I
up
had no
doors
idea.
because he showed that it's not just because he knew one famous international journalist, BBC journalist, but it's because he worked at it, did well academically, opened doors for the other Kosovars. So
I'll tell you another story. Well, that's really good news, and until you told me, I didn't know that. But I'll tell you another story. When he was going back for his second year, he'd come back for the summer, and he'd gone. I think he had to go to Skopje to get his visa renewed. And he called me and he said, "Look, there's a problem with the visa. I don't know what the problem is, but they're not giving it to me."
Yeah.
And I was back in Jerusalem, and so I thought, oh yes. So there was a guy who was working for Tony Blair, who was the Prime Minister of the UK at the time, and I knew this guy who was working for him because he used to be BBC correspondent, and I called him and I said, "Look, here's the story. Here's this young lad who we've helped out and now is being educated in the UK. And he's having problems with his visa, and they're not going to give him his visa. He might not be able to go home, but go back to the UK for his second year." I said, "I would hate to have to write about this." He said, "I understand completely. Don't worry." And I'm telling you, within 2 hours, he'd sorted out the whole thing.
Got the visa.
Yeah. Which again, you know, maybe I'm using my privileges in the media to do that, but I did think that I sort of felt a responsibility to at least let him finish what he was doing. And so, yeah, one of my colleagues, Kevin Bishop, sort of looked after him quite a bit when he was in the UK. He was a producer who'd spent a lot of time here. I was living in Jerusalem, so I was a long way off. Well, I'm very glad that there was a consequence that they take people from here, because they're amazing schools.
Now, I got reconnected with you watching your reports on Bucha and Ukraine that you started doing recently.
Yeah.
And it's sort of immediately, you've been covering other wars, but it immediately brought me back to this, to Kosovo. Many Kosovars, maybe that's just us, but many Kosovars feel there's a lot of similarities between Kosovo and Ukraine. If you go to Grand Hotel, which you wanted to see because that was the working hotel, you see a big I Love Ukraine poster. Kosovars are hosting and paying for 20 journalists that have moved from Ukraine to Kosovo in a program to offer a stay to Ukrainian journalists as long as they want to. On the other hand, Ukraine doesn't recognize Kosovo, but that is not what I want to ask you about. I want to ask you about last week you were in Kharkiv. You've been following that war for the last 2 years. Do you think there's any parallels to here?
Yeah, there are parallels. There's parallels in that there are people who want to run their own affairs and be independent, and they have a powerful neighbor who believes that territory, who's president anyway, believes that territory should be part of his country, as it once was in the days of the USSR. And he has gone to war. He's invaded the country to stop that, to kill their independence. And clearly that's a parallel with here, where people wanted to not just regain their autonomous status, but become independent, which Milosevic was prepared to use violence to stop that happening. So there are those, but I think there's quite a significant difference as well, which was, in the end, NATO did intervene here, but I think right from the outset in Ukraine, certainly in the full-scale invasion that happened in, when was it, 2021? 22. The outside world is much more concerned about what's happening. And that's because Russia is directly involved. Russia's got nuclear weapons and an authoritarian president who at times threatens to use them. So that's one of the big differences. I think some people looked on some politicians in the West, in Western Europe and in America, looked on the fall of Yugoslavia and the consequences of all of that for everybody who lived here as something which maybe you could try and build a wall around it. I don't think anybody feels you can build a wall around Ukraine.
Wasn't Kosovo supposed to be the last war in Europe?
Yeah.
Did anybody think we're going to have a war in Europe again?
You know, I was just writing this morning for the BBC about some things that occurred to me on this visit. And it starts off with the absolute shock that I had back in Croatia, in fact, in 1991, where I went into a village there, and it was a beautiful afternoon, the sun was gorgeous, the light was fantastic, but the village was on fire, there were tanks moving, and I'd been in wars already at that point in my life, but I thought, my God, no one has seen anything like this in Europe since World War II, and that was 91. Now, sadly, it's almost normal. You know, we had the wars of Yugoslavia, and then since, well, 2014 in Ukraine. And it's sad that we are now in a period where war is something that is shaping our experience. War, authoritarianism, populism is shaping the way that we live in a way that I don't think it has since the first half of the 20th century. And that's why some people now, and it's very alarming to hear it, we have politicians and generals in the UK who say, we are now living in a pre-war period. Clearly wars are going on already for some people, but we've had generals and politicians saying it's a pre-war period. In other words, we have to prepare for things that might be worse, which is an awful. You know, I have 2 children in their 20s. It's a terrible thing to hear.
There's another thing that I notice now. I'm following another war as a viewer, not working with you. When I see you in Ukraine, I worry when I don't see you in the news, because we know the war is happening, and there's royal family news in the BBC. There's less interest than it was over Kosovo, I feel. We were filing regular stories, and we were a much smaller war than Ukraine, I must admit. Like, we are not 40 million people. We were 2 million people, less than 2, and BBC had 3 9 o'clock news pieces throughout the week. It's unimaginable today.
Well, we did something similar just after the full-scale invasion. They anchored the main programs from Kyiv for weeks and weeks and weeks. And then slowly, and we had loads of reports, and slowly, there was less and less.
But now
and that's because, I'll tell you what happens, it's the news business. If things keep happening the same way, and they're just going on almost in the background, people's attention goes elsewhere. It's probably wrong, but there's only a certain amount of bandwidth that broadcasters, like politicians or like individuals, can have. So what I try and do when I go there now, back at the beginning, when something first happens, you can basically, just small events, you can get them on. You can get them on the air. But now, what I try and do is spend longer to come up with something that looks into the roots of what's happening, to try to explain more deeply what's going on. So, for example, the pieces we did from Kharkiv, I did a long TV piece, a radio, and a big piece on the BBC website. You know, we probably spent, 7 days gathering that material and putting it together.
So tell us, what's going on in Kharkiv as you left last week?
Well, what's going on is that the Ukrainians are losing at the moment in that area.
I didn't want to hear that, but you put it very bluntly.
No, they are. I mean, I think they're a long way from being defeated in the war, but the Russians have learned lessons about the way to fight. They have adapted. They are very clever with electronic warfare. They're also getting, they've put their economy onto a war footing, so they have producing a lot of weapons. The Chinese are giving them machine tools and electronics that Western sanctions were hoping to stop getting to Russia. They buy drones from Iran, they buy shells from North Korea, they sell oil to the Chinese and to the Indians. And meanwhile, the Ukrainians are dependent, particularly on the Americans, and the Americans are very focused inwards. So most recent supplemental budget of $60 billion for the Ukrainians was held up for months and months and months in the US Congress because of the divided nature of politics there. And the consequences of that on the battlefield is that the Ukrainians don't have enough weapons. They also don't have enough soldiers because there are only 40 million Ukrainians and there are, what, 150 million Russians? So all in all, I think you can't say, as I say, they're a long way from being defeated. But at the moment, the Russians are having victories. Only small victories, but they're victories. And that's a change and something which I think, at the moment, means that President Putin in the Kremlin is probably feeling a lot more happy about the situation, and he's probably waiting to see if Donald Trump wins the elections in the US, in the hope that maybe he won't give Ukraine the help that Joe Biden has been giving them.
What will happen if Trump wins for Ukraine? We know it's not a good news for Kosovo either, but
probably not.
For Ukraine was.
I think probably not good news insofar, I mean, this is wild speculation, okay?
Yeah.
But probably not great news because he's gone back to the old American credo of isolationism, which was their great motivator for a lot of their policies until the Second World War. America's a continent. They have tremendous wealth and resources and people, and they were looking in. And he sees also relationships with countries and foreign policy not as shared interests, but as deals, transactional. Okay, I'll do this for you. You need to do this for me. That's how it works. In his own head. So the thing, though, about Trump is unpredictable, and if he wins, it's still an if, we don't know. If he wins, he's hard to predict the way he might jump.
We're in the end of the interview. Jeremy, I can't not ask you whether it's easier to cover a war or beat cancer.
Oh yes, I had cancer. I think cancer is much more alarming. I had cancer, which I've now been discharged by the hospital after.
How long did it take you to beat it?
I had stage 3 bowel cancer, so it was in my bowel and in the lymph nodes around it. I didn't have any symptoms. I found out by chance. I had surgery. So then I had more than 6 months of chemotherapy. I couldn't work for a year.
For a year?
I didn't work for a year, no.
I appreciate your journalism. I'm really a consumer of your reports, watching them in Ukraine, and you don't seem to get more senile. Your writing sounds better.
No, I think.
But can you physically run around the front lines?
We were in Irpin, next to Kiev, when the Russians were trying to push into the city, the very beginning after the full-scale invasion. And I was working with a cameraman you also know, Fred Scott, who's about the same age as me. He was born in 61, I was born in 60. And we were with helping us out. We had a safety guy who was a former British officer, who was a man in his 30s. And he said to us, you know, the Russians are shelling us now, guys, Fred, Jeremy, we need to run. Can you run? I said, yeah, of course I can run. I could run quite fast. I mean, I had my flak jacket, my helmet on, but yeah, I can run. I'm still reasonably mobile. I try not to do the running around the front line I might have done 20 or 30 years ago, and that's mostly because I don't have I'm more of a gutless coward. I'm more concerned about getting killed I'm more conscious of the danger than maybe I would have been when I was 30.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you for making the journey to come here, stopping covering your war to make time for us. Don't stop until you drop. Ishte ky, Jeremy Bowen, gazetori I BBC-së, I cili edhe pse I ka 64 vjet, është të shku prej një fronti të luftës në tjetrin, edhe të vazhdu punën, pa na ankesë pse I ka bo do vjet, po vazhdon me raportu që kjo është gazetaria e vërtet. Kaq kishim për sonte, vazhdojnë me ashtu kalzo.com deri në emisionin e radhës për neve këtu në Reporting House, natën e mirë.